Hello and welcome to Daniel and Revelation Prophetic Bible Study. We are on session 14. We started chapter 8 last week. We could not complete all that, so we looked through the life of Cyrus. We studied pretty much on the ram, but we are going to study tonight the goat. But for the just sake of reference, for the sake of the continuity, I'm going to skim through the first few verses without any explanation. And then when we get to the point where we need to study about the goat representing Alexander the Great, I'm going to introduce the new material. So if you want to know more about the ram, please watch chapter 8, part 1, which is session 13. So tonight we are continuing from where we left off last week. We will study about the Alexander the Great and Antiochus Epiphanes. So these two characters are the main characters tonight. Last week we talked about the ram and a goat, vision of a ram and a goat. So that is what we are going to continue to study here. Daniel chapter 8 verse 1. In the third year of the reign of King Belshazzar, a vision appeared to me, even to me. So the reason it is written like that was in King James Version and New King James Version, the to me was repeated twice. In King James it was said even to me, but in other translations they omitted that. So when I read myself first time, I said, what is something wrong here? But when I looked at it, it was repeated. Even to me is like expression that this vision appeared to me, even to me. Like, sometimes it could be saying like, I'm not worthy, but I got this dream. Either way, it is there in the original text. I want to make that point, and that's why I put that in the parenthesis here. So after the one that appeared to me the first time. So remember, Daniel had a vision before. In chapter 7, he saw a vision. This is the second vision Daniel had. And also we talked about the near and the far fulfillments last week. So it is also called dual fulfillment. That means you have a fulfillment one time and then the same kind of a fulfillment happens at the second time with a larger or a grander scale. So the reason we need to understand this is because tonight we are going to study about a little horn, and that little horn is not the Antichrist, but there is going to be a little horn which we already studied in chapter 7, which also represents the Antichrist, which is going to be fulfilled, or we are going to study at length in the book of Revelation. So Antiochus Epiphanes is the near fulfillment. The Antichrist is the far fulfillment. If you can understand that, then we can, that is a kind of a dual fulfillment. With that, verse 2, I saw in the vision, and it so happened while I was looking that I was in the Shushan, the citadel, which is in the province of Elam, and I saw in the vision that I was by the river Ulai. So you remember last week we studied about Daniel was in the place where the river Ulai was, and then he had this vision. He was able to see the Shushan, the citadel, and last week I explained this about this palace at great length. So in verse 3, then I lifted up my eyes and saw, and there standing beside me a river was a ram which had two horns, and the two horns were high, but one was higher than the other, and the higher one came up last. So I explained this, that these two horns represent Medo and Persian kingdoms, and the Persian kingdom came last, but that was the higher, which usurped more authority over the Medians. So we studied about Cyrus the Great, the one of the horns representing that. I saw the ram pushing westward, northward, and southward, so that no animal could withstand him, nor was there any that could deliver from his hand, but he did according to his will and became great. So this represents Cyrus represents the Persian Empire. They even overcame the Babylon and took over everything. So we studied this last week. So in session 13. So just to summarize what we studied, the Persian period mainly represents the Cyrus being the first king of this. Cyrus the Great, he is called Cyrus the Great, and he is the one, he did a lot of good things, especially for the Jews. So Cyrus the Great, 560 to 530 BC, king of Persia, after conquering Babylon, allowed the exiled Jews to go back to their homeland under the leadership of Zerubbabel. So, according to the list of Ezra 2 and Nehemiah 7, about 50,000 responded to Cyrus' offer of an opportunity to return to their homes. So, when he proclaimed that the Jews could go back, but not all of them are interested in going back, because some of them are well settled in Babylon and they had homes, they have, all the things. So not everybody used it. But here in Ezra 2 and Nehemiah 7 gives an account of about 50,000 responded to Cyrus' offer to return to their homeland. Some of the exiles availed the opportunity, but while others remained in Babylon. Those who stayed back continued to support and have commerce with Judah. They also started to have houses of worship and study, which rise to an institution called synagogues. So I just want to explain the term synagogue, because I did not do that last time. So when you look at the temple, the Solomon built the temple. The Jews have a temple where they go, they worship, they make sacrifices and all that. But remember, when Nebuchadnezzar went the third time, he destroyed everything. So he just destroyed the temple, and he took the vessels and everything. So now there is no place for them to go and worship, especially during the exile. Especially when they were in Babylon, there is no temple for them. So for a Jew, they need a temple. They need to go there and worship. They have to have a temple, but they didn't have a temple. So what they come up with is an institution called a synagogue. A synagogue is some kind like a church, if you will, like a building where they all get together. During the time of Jesus went to synagogues, although they have temple at the time, but they have synagogues also. The concept of synagogues especially started during the time of exile, because they didn't have a temple to go to, and then they started these synagogues in almost every cities. So that is about synagogue, if you come across synagogue. And of course that continued throughout the New Testament, and also we see synagogues even today in various cities. Cyrus also financed the project of the building of the second Jewish temple and returned the plunder from the temple. We saw that last week. So Cyrus was obedient to what he received, the word of God, through prophet Isaiah, and also he wanted to being obedient to that and let the exiles go, and also he financed the project for them. And also we studied in the other sessions, as mentioned in Ezra chapter 1 and verse 7, King Cyrus also brought out the articles of the house of the Lord, which Nebuchadnezzar had taken from Jerusalem and put in the temple of his God. So he returned all those articles of the house of God. You remember in chapter 5, these are the articles, these are the golden vessels and all that King Belshazzar took out of for drinking his wine and all that, and then the handwriting on the wall. We studied that in chapter 5. So King Cyrus actually returned all these articles, and also he financed the project for the Jewish people to go back to build the temple. That's why I also showed you a Israeli coin that has the picture of Cyrus. And even to date, they respect Cyrus because he is one of the leaders that even the Gentile leaders that let them go back. In fact, even financed the project to build the temple. So that is all about Cyrus we studied last week. So please watch session 13 for additional details on that. So verse 5, and as I was considering, suddenly a male goat came from the west across the surface of the whole earth without touching the ground, and the goat had a notable horn between his eyes. So we studied ram, that is all about Cyrus, and not just the Cyrus. Don't think that it is representing only Cyrus. It is representing the Persian Empire. Of course, Cyrus is the first king. It lasted for several years. So after several years, there were other kings. After all that, then that is what is happening now in verse 5. A male goat came from the west across the surface of the whole earth without touching the ground, and the goat had a notable horn between his eyes. So the goat is represented as the Greek Empire. The notable horn represents Alexander the Great. So Daniel did not write the names Alexander the Great, Cyrus, these names Daniel did not write, or Antiochus Epiphanes. But clearly we can, when looking back at the history, we know who he is writing about. It is so precise. So the goat had a notable horn. In verse 6, then he came, that is the goat, came to the ram that had two horns, which I had seen standing beside the river, and ran at him with a furious power. So that is what the goat did. So he came to the ram and with a furious power and attacked this ram. And as I saw him confronting the ram, he was moved with rage against him. Why did he moved with rage? Because if you look at study the history, I didn't have time to really come up bring all the history what happened. If you look at the Persians attacked Greek and Macedonia a couple of times, but they were pushed back. So although Alexander the Great, he wasn't born when these attacks happened, but they had this national pride, so this country attacked us. So they had some kind of a rivalry going on, and now he had the opportunity to go back and attack this ram, the Persian Empire. That is why we are seeing here, he has moved with rage against him, attacked the ram, and broke his two horns. So the two horns represents the Media and Persian empires. There was no power in the ram to withstand him. Once it was a great and a mighty power, even defeated Babylon. But now when the goat attacked this Persian empire, there was no power in the ram to withstand him. But he cast him down to the ground and trampled him, and there was no one that could deliver the ram from his hand. And of course, that is exactly what happened. When you take a history book and study what happened with Alexander the Great, he just went wherever he went there, he conquered all the places. And that's why this goat, in the previous verse, we see that without touching the ground, that means with the speed and with the force that he attacked the nations that he conquered. So Daniel chapter 8 verse 7. So the next one, here we see Alexander the Great, also known as Alexander III. And sometimes you also call him as Alexander from the Macedonia. So he was born 356 BC, and his birth location Pella and modern day Thessaloniki in Greece. And he died on June 13th, 323 BC. So very short life. So around 32 years old. So he died near Babylon, near Macedonia, who overthrew the Persian Empire, carried Macedonian arms into India, and laid the foundations of the Hellenistic world of its territorial kingdoms. In essence, what this explains is he spread his Hellenistic views throughout these countries, all this thing, even from India, the Punjab regions, to all these areas, the Persian empires, onto the other kingdoms. So pretty much he conquered, and it was told about him that he was finally crying or sad that there is no more to conquer. There is nothing else left over for him to conquer. So that is said about his condition. So now when he was doing, wherever he goes to conquer these places. An interesting thing happened, especially when he was approaching Jerusalem. This priest, Jaddua, had a dream that he would be protected by God from the king Alexander. As Alexander was pursuing to conquer Jerusalem, he had this dream. So with that dream, he went to meet Alexander when he was coming. So upon seeing Jaddua, Alexander relented his pursuit, as he too had a dream seeing a figure who took the form of Jaddua. So it's a kind of a funny thing that happened to Alexander, and also at the same time. So that's why Jerusalem was spared. So if you look at the history, wherever he goes, he conquers and then make them like slaves or all that. But in case of Jerusalem, he kind of left them. Of course, they were paying tributes and all that, but they were given the choice of the religious freedoms were given to them. So that is what happened, especially in this case. And also, if you look at, Alexander agreed to let Jaddua and the Jews keep the laws of their forefathers in return for a military cooperation. So Josephus, one of the very important first century historians, recorded this. Josephus included an account of Alexander reading the book of Daniel and believing that the prophecy regarding the destruction of the Achaemenid Empire that's the Persian Empire I mentioned last week. It's another name. Persian Empire was talking about him and his future conquests. The account details Alexander's visit to Jerusalem. So here is the summary of this. So when Alexander the Great, he was going to attack or go to Jerusalem, this priest went ahead to him to meet him, and also he presented the book of Daniel and especially the chapter 8 where all this conquest was mentioned. And that again impressed Alexander the Great and spared these people and gave them the religious freedoms to worship their gods and keep the laws of their forefathers. And when the book of Daniel was showed to him, wherein Daniel declared that one of the Greeks should destroy the empire of the Persians, he supposed that himself was the person intended. And as he was then glad, he dismissed the multitude for the present and bid them ask with what favors they pleased of him, whereupon the high priest desired that they might enjoy the laws of their forefathers and might pay no tribute on the 7th year. He granted all they desired. Josephus recorded these meticulous details. It is very interesting. So Jews on the 7th year, they don't want to pay the tribute because they don't work on the 7th year, which is a sabbatical year. So he agreed to that, and also he agreed for them to continue their religious practices. So this is what happened, especially with when Alexander the Great reached to Jerusalem. This is from the Josephus, the complete works, chapter 8, if you can find that volume. So that is where you can find these details from the history from Josephus, Flavius Josephus. And when they entreated him that he would permit the Jews in Babylon and Media to enjoy their own laws also, he willingly promised to do hereafter what they desired. And when he said to the multitude that if any of them would enlist themselves in his army on this condition, they should continue under their laws of their forefathers and live according to them, he was willing to take them with him. Many were ready to accompany him in his wars. So basically he had an agreement with these people, right? So that's what it happens. Alexander and normally when you conquer, there is no agreement. You don't mark with any kinds of terms of agreement. But here we see Alexander the Great was able to come to terms with what the priests were requesting. So a couple of things to note down. They were given the religious freedoms to worship, to continue to worship, and they were excused from paying the tribute on the 7th year. So all these were given, and they were also able to join and help Alexander the Great on his conquests, as long as, so he is allowing them to do all this. So verse 8, therefore the male goat grew very great, but when he became strong, the large horn was broken. So the male goat represents the Greek Empire, and the large horn represents Alexander the Great. So now if you read this verse again, therefore the male goat grew very great, but when he became strong, the large horn was broken, and in place of it, 4 notable ones came up toward the 4 winds of heaven. So here what happened, we know the history. As I said, we have the luxury now to look back and read the history. So now what happened was Alexander the Great died, and 4 of his notable generals took over this land, so they started splitting the empire into 4. So here Alexander the Great defeated Persians in 332 BC. He subdued and conquered all the known world at that time. So it's a remarkable history, remarkable character. Although the male goat magnified himself, at the height of his power, the large horn was broken, referring to Alexander's sudden death at the peak of his greatness. So when he died, the 4 generals took over the empire, right? So the 4 conspicuous horns that replaced him describe Alexander's 4 generals that divided the Hellenistic Empire. So those 4 generals were Cassander, or he took over Macedon and Greece, and Lysimachus over Thrace and Asia Minor, and Seleucus over Syria and Babylon, and Ptolemy over Egypt. So just for because we cannot study all of these people, but for our discussion and for this chapter, we are going to focus on the last two. So because the Antiochus Epiphanes, that guy come from this Seleucus, the Syrian empire. So the last two are important for our discussion. So here is a map. If you look at it, of course, those two are the ones that are major portions are, on the Egypt, the Ptolemy I said, and on the green one. So the purple and the green, those are the two ones that we are going to focus on. But of course, the others have the smaller portions, but these are the two main characters. And of course, if you look at the map, if you are in Egypt or if you are in the green zone and the purple zone, and if these two empires started fighting, so what happens? Where do they meet? It's on Jerusalem. So that's the path. So that's why always these people were kind of in between these two empires. Following his death, after a period of intense struggle for the power, his four generals divided the empire among themselves. Judea and the diaspora soon came under the domination of the two of the generals, Ptolemy and Seleucus. That's what I mentioned, that we will be studying morely on the Ptolemy and the Seleucus empires, because these are the ones that they started fighting, and in between was the Jewish people, so Judea. So diaspora is like, these people were spread out to Persia or Babylon. Now because the empire was so great, so vast, after so many kings took over these lands, so Jews was kind of scattered to almost a lot of places. So that is why we call them the diaspora. So Judea and the diaspora soon came under the domination of these two of these generals, Ptolemy and Seleucus. So Judea around 200 BC came under the Seleucid rulers. Many diaspora Jews were attracted by the Hellenized culture in Jerusalem. The strength of the Hellenists grew, and they appointed their high priests, Jason and Menelaus, who hailed themselves with Seleucid tyrant Antiochus Epiphanes, who wanted to Hellenize Judea by force. So one thing that is different with the Greek Empire is they wanted to make everybody Greek culture. So they spread out this. So that is what we call this Hellenistic. When you see this word Hellenistic, means spreading out the Greek culture, spreading out the Greek customs and everything about Greek. So it started with Alexander the Great, but down the line, the other rulers of those kingdoms, they even spread more, and especially when we come to the Seleucid tyrant Antiochus Epiphanes, he wanted to Hellenize even Judea by force. Remember, Alexander the Great gave exemptions to Judea, but now when this ruler came, he did not want to give any exemptions to the Judean people or the Jewish people. So that's why we see that kind of a change until here also. So Hellenistic is described as relating to Greek history, language, and culture from the death of Alexander the Great to the defeat of the Cleopatra and Mark Antony by Octavian in 31 BC. So I'm giving you some terms because I'm using this Hellenistic and all that, so you need to have understanding what I'm talking about here. So it is especially spreading out the Greek culture, spreading out all this. So if you look at it, just on the side note, if you look at it, this actually paved the way for spreading of the gospel. If you look at this, what happened was, before this Greek culture, everybody have their own language, everybody have their own culture. By the time Jesus came on the scene, by the time when he came and preached, and by the time the New Testament was written, what happened? Everything was Greek. So it's now easy to spread this message, right? So that's why New Testament is written in what? Greek. So if you pick up a original New Testament, it is written in Greek. So in other words, so Alexander the Great and his conquests and the spreading of this Greek culture and history also paved the way for spreading of the gospel. By the time when we get to the New Testament, so the Greek was already well established. In fact, I should also make another side note here. Now the Jews are to this point here. They even, some of them could not even read their own language, the Hebrew. So now the Torah, the Old Testament, has to be translated into Greek so that the people can read the Old Testament in the language that they can understand. So they commissioned 70 scholars to do this project. So what is this project? To translate Hebrew Bible, the Torah, all those books, the law and the prophets, into Greek. That project is called what? Septuagint. If you have come across a word called Septuagint, that means 70. The actual meaning is 70. So what they did was basically they translated the Old Testament into Greek, and this was done 300 BC. So now if somebody comes to you and argues like, oh no, Daniel was written way after all these things happened, but you have a Greek Septuagint which was written 300 years before, 300 BC, you have a copy of it, Daniel is already there, and these events happened after that. So you can clearly see the difference, and that's why it is very interesting to see these prophecies getting fulfilled. Okay, during this period, Greek culture flourished, spreading through the Mediterranean and into the Near East and Asia, and centering on Alexandria in Egypt and Pergamum in Turkey. So as I said, the main goal for this Greek Empire was to spread their culture, spread their language, spread their way of life. Verse 9, and out of one of them came a little horn, which grew exceedingly great, toward the south, toward the east, toward the glorious land. So far we are talking about the goat, which represents the Greek Empire, and then Alexander the Great died, and then we have these 4 generals coming up, and I gave you the list of those generals. And now what is in verse 9 it says is, and out of one of them, that is out of one of those 4, came a little horn, which grew exceedingly great, towards the south, toward the east, and toward the glorious land. So the little horn is the Antiochus Epiphanes. Out of one of those 4 horns grew a little horn that started small, but became very large and very powerful. You have these parallels from last week's, the chapter 7 discussion, right? So you studied about a little horn, and also we talked about he speaks pompous words and he blasphemes the God in heaven, so which represents Antichrist. But here we see a small horn, started small but grew very large, very powerful. One of the divisions of the Greek Empire would emerge a king of unusual significance. So this guy is not Antichrist. I just want to make a note here. This guy is not Antichrist. This guy is the Antiochus Epiphanes. Yeah. So this little horn represents the 8th ruler of the Seleucid Greek Empire. So now from Alexander the Great to this guy that you have that this guy is the 8th ruler of the Seleucid Greek Empire, Antiochus IV Epiphanes, and his time period 175 to 163 BC. And here you have these coins showing him. And although his nephew, son of his older brother, Seleucus IV, was the rightful heir to the throne, Antiochus gained this position through bribery and flattery. So he tried to make his way somehow and became the ruler. So he is not the rightful ruler, as it says. After Antiochus IV ascended to the throne of Greco-Syria, as did many rulers, he appended the title Epiphanes, meaning God manifest. So that is not his name. His name was Antiochus IV. So he added his title, God manifest. I am the God. So that is his title. So Epiphanes means God manifest. He is actually calling himself God. So that is why his name is called now Antiochus Epiphanes. To his name. But many people, especially the Jewish people, were so angry about him, so they called him, instead of Epiphanes, they called him Epimanes. That means a madman. So it's a word game, like you just change a few syllables or characters, and then it rhymes the same, but it makes a different meaning. You are not God the manifest, you are the madman. So that is what they are saying. So Epiphanes to the Epimanes, that's the God manifest to the madman. He made notable conquests in the south, especially the south. You see that the purple in the picture I showed you earlier, the Egypt, the east, Persia and Parthia and Armenia, and the beautiful land which is calling the Palestine. Palestine is called the beautiful because, not as I said last time, it's not because of its scenery but because of its spiritual significance. So I gave some cross references. So, I'm not going to pull all those verses here, but you can take a note on that. And verse 10, and it grew up to the host of heaven, and it cast down some of the host and some of the stars to the ground, and trampled them. He even exalted himself as high as the prince of the host. And by him the daily sacrifices were taken away, and the place of his sanctuary was cast down. This is one of the very difficult words to understand. So because he talks about the host of heaven and the stars. So I'm going to simplify this. What basically is doing is the Antiochus guy, he is now trampling or persecuting the Jewish people. If you remember the dream that Joseph had in the book of Genesis. So the 12 stars and the moon and the sun, the 12 stars represents the the children of Jacob, the Jewish people. So here, in other words, what is he doing is he is basically torturing or trampling the stars, and also as high as the prince of the host. The prince of the host is basically alluding to the God of the Jews. So he is boasting about the God of the Jews. So that is what is happening here. And then what is he doing? And by him, the daily sacrifices were taken away. So now he is going to, you remember, you have to keep that in mind. So Alexander the Great gives a lot of permissions to them to continue their religious liberty. They worshipped. That was not taken away until now. So this guy was very forceful, and now he is going to take away the daily sacrifices, and the place of the sanctuary was cast down. So the prince of the host represents to the God of the Old Testament. So that is why it talks about he is actually exalting himself. He is in fact he is saying that I am God. So that's why he called himself that, the Epiphanes. But now he's also saying that who is that God above me? So it's basically denying the prince of the host. So threw some of the starry host down to the earth and trampled on them signifies that Antiochus would persecute the Jewish saints in Palestine. Trampled upon them suggests severe persecution. Antiochus' persecution of the Jews may be considered to have begun in 170 BC, around 170, with the assassination of the high priest Ananias III, and terminated in 163 BC at his death. So the way it all started was initially he actually forced and appointed the priests that were favorable to him. And then finally he came and then desecrated the place. We are going to see what he did, all that. So during this period, he executed thousands of Jews who resisted his unfair regulations. So these unfair regulations were against the religious laws. So for a Jew, what is important? To follow the Mosaic laws. So all the laws that they were given to them through Moses, right? So these are very important for a Jew. So now when you tell them not to follow or not to obey, so they are going to rebel. So that's why you see he executed thousands of Jews who resisted his unfair regulations. In 169 BC, after a humiliating experience in Egypt, so this guy went to Egypt to attack the Ptolemies, and then there he was resisted by the Roman commander Popilius Laenas, the Syrian king, the Antiochus. Now he is so mad that he was, resisted there. So he came back. As I said, this is the path between the southern kingdom and the northern kingdom. So now he went there, but he was resisted. He's coming back. Now he is taking his revenge. He is taking his anger or frustration of his loss or defeat on the people of the Judea, the Palestine area. So that is what he was doing basically when he is coming back. So the deeds of murder of Antiochus said to have included the slaughter of 80,000 men, women, boys, girls, even infants by Antiochus soldiers during this attack upon Jerusalem. So horrific was the details, some of that was really horrible. In December 167 BC, Antiochus committed his crowning act of sacrilege against the Jewish religion by erecting an altar to Zeus in the temple precincts and offering swine on it. Jews will not to do or have anything to do with the swine or pigs, So this guy take a pig and then sacrificed it on the altar, desecrating the Holy of the Holies, desecrating the Jewish temple. So that is what happened here. He even erected a some people say that it is the statue of a Jupiter or Zeus, whatever those Greek gods. That's what he actually put that in the temple itself by desecrating the Jewish temple. So in verse 12, because of the transgression, an army was given over to the horn to oppose the daily sacrifices, and he cast truth down to the ground. He did all this and prospered. So it looks like whatever he is doing, he was able to do that and prosper. So that is what happening here. And in 13, then I heard a holy one speaking, and another holy one said to that certain one who was speaking, how long will the vision be concerning the daily sacrifices and the transgression of the desolation, the giving of both the sanctuary and the host to be trampled underfoot? So you remember, this is a vision that the Daniel was watching, and there's a person who is explaining, interpreting to Daniel, and the question is, how long this is going to happen? The desecration of the temple, all this, how long it's going to happen? And here is the answer. So the answer is, and he said to me, for 2,300 days. In some of your translations, it says for 2,000 evenings and mornings. So the way of Jewish way of writing is that evenings and morning is one day. So for modern translations, I picked up and said like for 2,300 days, then the sanctuary shall be cleansed. So even this was clearly foretold that what is going to happen. If you think that way, even there is a timeline, how long this guy is going to do this damage. So how long this guy is going to desecrate the temple. So for 2,300 days. Some scholars, some people, when they read this little horn, they automatically associate this guy with the Antichrist. But the problem is, the Antichrist, if you read that in the book of Revelation, although there are so many parallels, as I said, this is a near fulfillment, but there is a greater far fulfillment at the end. So even the timeline is different. Like here you have 2,300 days, whereas in case of Antichrist, the timeline is very clear. It is 7 years. Even the half of that is 3.5 years. So those are different timelines. So that's why this Antiochus Epiphanes, here we have 2,300 days. So, the first part is the vision, and then, of course, the half of the rest of the chapter is Gabriel interpreting the vision. Of course, when we read the first part of the chapter, we started already interpreting these verses for ourselves, right? Even before Gabriel came to us and interpreting. So, now we are going to kind of review some of this, what we already studied, of course, the first few verses. So, but actually, Gabriel was interpreting this dream to Daniel from verse 15. Then it happened when I, Daniel, had this vision and was seeking the meaning, that suddenly there stood before me one having the appearance of a man. And I heard a man's voice between the banks of the Ulai, who called and said, Gabriel, make this man understand the vision. So a commandment was given to Gabriel to go and help Daniel to understand the vision. So he came near where I stood, and when he came, I was afraid and fell on my face. But he said to me, understand, son of man, that the vision refers to the time of the end. So here the Gabriel came to Daniel and started explaining, okay, so you understand these are the things that are going to happen towards the timeline, towards the end. So I want to make a point here. Whenever you see that it refers to the time of the end, that does not mean that's the end times. So sometimes if you are talking about a particular, let's say, a particular empire, like for example, maybe a Greek empire or Seleucid empire, if you talk about the end of that empire, that is also considered as the time of the end. So you have to read this in context. Otherwise, we may always think that, okay, end of the time is always the end of the time, like what the book of Revelation says. But that is not the case in this here, especially with this interpretation given. So you need to make a note on this one. So the end of the time, this end of the time is not talking about the end of the time that was talked about in the book of Revelation. So here this is very significant about the Seleucid Empire and the events that are talking about, and especially with the little horn we are focused on. So Daniel was worried about this little horn, and this little horn represents Antiochus Epiphanes, or Antiochus IV. So that is the end. The timeline is talking about the end of this guy. So the little horn here. Verse 18. Now as he was speaking with me, I was in deep sleep with my face to the ground, but touched me and stood me as upright. And he said, Look, I am making known to you what shall happen in the later time of the indignation, for at the appointed time the end shall be. So here again, as I said, whatever we have studied thus far, Gabriel is explaining to Daniel. In verse 20, the ram which you saw having two horns, they are the kings of Media and Persia. So that's what we studied, right? And in verse 21, and the male goat is the kingdom of Greece. So the large horn is between its eyes is the first king. Okay, so now you are reading these from the book of Daniel. Daniel chapter 8 verse 20 and 21 is talking very clearly about these two horns representing Media and Persia. And also it's talking about the male goat mentioning Greece, and its first horn representing the first king. The only thing missing is the names were not given in this here. So then, like Cyrus is not mentioned, but Alexander the Great is not mentioned. But if you read this verse, keep in mind when is this written, or when this vision happened to Daniel. This is still during the time of Babylonian Empire. When you are in the Babylonian Empire during the time before Belshazzar's demise, and now if you read this, you have a clear understanding what is going to happen here. So they are the two kings, the Media and the Persia, and you have the large horn representing Alexander the Great. This is one kind of a long overview of the future kingdoms given to Daniel when he was still in the Babylonian court. Verse 22, as for the broken horn and the four that stood up in its place, four kingdoms shall arise out of the nation, but not with its power. So here again we just studied that the four kingdoms represents the four generals that come out of the Alexander the Great, the Greek Empire, and shall arise out of the nation, but not with its power. And in the later time of their kingdom, that is, we are talking about the four generals. They have these four kingdoms, but their power is not as the power of Alexander the Great. You remember, Alexander the Great has a vast power. He is the sole emperor, if you will, for the whole Greek Empire. But now these four generals are not in the same capacity, or not in the same power. That's what you are talking about here. So the four kingdoms shall arise out of that nation, but not with its power like the power that what we saw earlier with Alexander the Great. But they have these four, they actually divided the kingdom. In verse 23, and in the later time of their kingdom, that is, after some years past, you have, as we already studied, that's the eighth ruler in the Seleucid kingdom. When the transgressors have reached their fullness, a king shall arise, having fierce futures, who understands sinister schemes. This is talking about that little horn that we just studied. It is talking about that Antiochus Epiphanes. And 24, his power shall be mighty, but not by his own power. This is a serious comment here. It talks about the power, but it also adds that it is not by his own power. What does that mean? But whose power is that then? Somebody is helping him. So right from the beginning, as you can see, this guy wanted to persecute Jews. This guy wanted to do anything against the God of heavens, the Jewish people. So here clearly what it is talking about is the power of Satan. His power shall be mighty, but not by his own power. He shall destroy fearfully, and shall prosper and thrive. He shall destroy the mighty and also the holy people. With an open mind, I want you to take any history book, especially the history of all the people groups. You won't find any similarities, towards the hatred that was shown on the Jewish people compared with any other group. In other words, the hatred that was shown towards the Jewish people is like, you cannot even expect, or you cannot even fathom. That is what my point was. And this is not a new thing. So let me just add a quick note here of what is happening here. I cannot give you all the details, but I am just touching on the highlights here. So at one point when Moses was born, remember how Moses was born? He was actually, when he was born, all the male children were supposed to be killed. Why? Because the Pharaoh want to eliminate all the Jewish people. You know the story, but Moses, they cannot keep Moses for long, so they put him in a basket, and of course the Pharaoh's daughter found him, and he went to the palace, and now he was survived and all that. But the idea is the killing of the babies, killing of the Jewish people started even way back, even in the time of Pharaoh. And then if you fast forward, of course there are several instances that happened to eliminate all the Jewish nation, all the Jewish people. If you read the book of Esther, in the book of Esther, what happens? Haman, he actually got a permission from the king, Persian king, to kill all the Jews, all the families, all the children. So he want to wipe out all the Jewish. Why? Why such hatred? It's the same hatred. And keep fast forwarding, even till very recent, what happened with the Holocaust. 6 million Jews were slaughtered. 6 million Jews. Think about that. Even that is not some Bible story. This is the even recent event happening. Behind all this is one common thing. If you could wipe out all the Jews, think about this. If you could wipe out all the Jews, then you can make God a liar, because God has promised the Jewish people certain blessings. In fact, before Christ was born, the reason for the hatred was, if you could wipe out Jews, like in the book of Esther, then there won't be Messiah, there won't be a Jesus that is to come. So, of course, you know the story how God delivered even from all those calamities. So the point is, even if Satan could eliminate all the Jews now, so Satan is making God a liar. So that is the story behind the hatred behind all this. This is just a glimpse. If you go do a study on just the hatred about Jews and all that, it is mind-boggling, so you can't even fathom, so especially even with the recent things that happened, like with Hitler and all that. Anyway, so the Satan is, these people are kind of like induced by a satanic force. The hatred for Jewish people exists even today. The anti-Semitism that is there today. So verse 24, his power shall be mighty, but not by his own power. So it's by satanic power. He shall destroy fearfully, and shall prosper and thrive. He shall destroy the mighty and also the holy people. So the time frame that was given to him, we studied, so that during that time frame, nobody is going to stop him, and he will prosper and thrive and destroy. Through cunning, he shall cause deceit to prosper under his rule. And he shall exalt himself in his heart. He shall destroy many in their prosperity. He shall even raise against the prince of princes, but he shall be broken without human means. So this guy was not killed by anybody. He was killed. Some stories said that he got some disease, and nobody could even approach him, and died a horrible death. So about Antiochus Epiphanes. Verse 26, and the visions of the evenings and mornings, that is 2,300 days we talked about, right? Evenings and mornings represents a day. So then the visions of the evenings and the mornings, which was told, is true. Therefore, seal up this vision, for it refers to many days in the future. So God reveals all this to Daniel, but God says, Daniel, it takes some time for all this to be fulfilled. So you don't have to worry about that, because if you look at from Daniel to this, there were hundreds of years that passed. So God is telling Daniel, seal up this vision, because it is going to take some time before all this will be fulfilled. And that is what happened. Remember, Daniel was still with Belshazzar's court when he got this vision. And from then you have the Persian kingdom, and then you have the Greek. And after 8th ruler of the Seleucid kingdom, we come to this guy, Antiochus Epiphanes. And verse 27, and I, Daniel, fainted and was sick for days. Afterward, I arose and went about the king's business. Of course, if somebody gets a dream like this, he would be sick. And that's what Daniel fainted and was sick for days. And after that, I went about the king's business. I was astonished by the vision, but no one understood it. First of all, it is hard for Daniel to understand. Actually, if you look at it, we are in a very better place understanding this chapter than Daniel himself. Now we know. We even know the names. We even know what these guys did. Because we can pick up any Encyclopedia Britannica. Some of the information I shared, I got from encyclopedias. So we have better understanding of this chapter than actually Daniel did. So that is why here he says, I was astonished by this vision, but no one understood it. So who is this Antiochus Epiphanes? So last week we studied Cyrus, and this week I gave you some details about Alexander the Great, and also we are going to study about who is this guy Antiochus Epiphanes. So Antiochus III was followed by his son Seleucus IV Philopator as the ruler of the Hellenistic Seleucid Empire in 187 BC. Antiochus IV Epiphanes ascended to the throne in 175 BC after Seleucus IV was assassinated. So the Jews were clearly targets of his strategy of Hellenization. So because the Jews had this special deal with Alexander the Great, I told you. So now when this guy came to power, so the Jews were clearly targets of his strategy of Hellenization, making them Greek, making the Greek culture, forcing them to do all what the Greeks did. He understood that to ultimately succeed in Egypt, he would need to disrupt the influence of the Jews within his own territories. On his way to conquer Egypt, he met with resistance from Roman army. After being humiliated and forced to leave Egypt, Antiochus' vengeance was quickly turned upon Jerusalem. Antiochus is depicted throughout the vision of Daniel as a foreshadowing the Antichrist. For instance, Antiochus is prophesied as attacking the wonderful things in God's temple, and the Antichrist will attack God by his words. You can read that in chapter 8:24 and 11:36. And both Antiochus and Antichrist will arouse God's indignation and anger. So we can see these two guys, whether Antiochus Epiphanes or the Antichrist in the book of Revelation, they will be judged. So the Jewish persecution began in 167 BC when Antiochus IV issued a decree outlawing Jewish religious practices. His goal was to make all the subjects of his kingdom into one people, giving them their customs. He began a program of forced Hellenization. So this is the theme that we saw. So this guy want to make them Hellenistic. So the king sent letters by messengers, a messenger to Jerusalem and to the cities of Judah, ordering them to follow customs foreign to their land, to prohibit burnt offerings, sacrifices, and libations in the sanctuary, to profane the Sabbaths and the feast days, to desecrate the sanctuary and the sacred ministers, to build pagan altars and temples and shrines, to sacrifice swine and unclean animals, to leave their sons uncircumcised, and to defile themselves with every kind of impurity and abomination, so that they might forget the law and change all its ordinances. So what is one single goal? If you read this passage, what is one single goal for this guy? He wants to force them to change, leave their religious laws, religious way of life, and turn to the Greek. So that's why he is now sending letters and forcing them, ordering them to follow these customs that are foreign to the land. That's why he killed 80,000 I showed you earlier. So you can read this in 1 Maccabees chapter 1 verses 44 and 49. So some of you may not know what this Maccabees is. So if you happen to find a book, a Catholic Bible, you will find this 1 Maccabees. So this 1 Maccabees, and there are some other books, those are not added in the Protestant Bible because they are not inspired. So the books has to be inspired. There is a criteria for these books to be inspired in the Holy Bible. So the additional books when they wrote it, they put a note. These would serve as a history references, but somehow that got into the Catholic Bible, and still to this day, if you find a Catholic Bible, you could still find these Maccabees and all these other additional books in the Bible. So with that aside, if you want to read the history, what happened, sometimes we say, we have this silent years, like, the last book in the Old Testament is what? Malachi. And then the New Testament, you have the Matthew, and then the gap is like 400 years. And people often call this 400 silent years. 400 silent years, there is no prophecy, nothing written. Of course, there was no prophecy, nothing happened from the God's point of view or sending prophets. So those silent years, that's why we call them silent years. But if you want to read the history from the Jewish perspective and the time that was there, you can read this as a history. I'm not recommending that you give the same value to these books as the other books in the Bible. But if you want to study the history, you can pick up a Catholic Bible and just read the first Maccabees and whatever, what happened. So this is just like reading some kind of a history, what is also called as intertestamental period. That means from between Old Testament and New Testament, the period between these two are called the intertestamental periods. So if you want to know what happened during that time, some of these books would help you. So the reference I'm giving you is from 1 Maccabees chapter 1 verses 44 to 49. And here also it says, anyone found with a copy of a Torah or obeying the religious practices or observing the Sabbath was put to death. In keeping with the decree, they put to death women who had their children circumcised, and they hung their babies from their necks. Their families also, and those who had circumcised them were killed. Again, you can read this in 1 Maccabees chapter 1. Jews were forced to build altars and to sacrifice unclean animals. So their persecution is at all-time high. Antiochus ordered his soldiers to kill the Jews whom they meet and slaughter the innocent who taken refuge in their homes. They killed young and the old, including women and children. In a span of 3 days, they killed 80,000 and sold 40,000 into slavery. You can read that in 2 Maccabees chapter 5 verses 11 to 14. So the atrocities done during this Jewish persecution under Antiochus is like mind-boggling. We cannot even comprehend how much they have to endure. In another occasion, a mother and her 7 sons were arrested and tortured for not eating pork. That's their sin, or for not eating pork. They were arrested in violation of God's laws. Antiochus ordered their tongues cut off and scalped them and cut off their hands and feet and roast the brothers on a frying pan, one after the other. And finally, the mother also was tortured and killed. So you can read that in 2 Maccabees chapter 7. So these are really horrible things that happened during this reign of Antiochus. Antiochus substituted the Jewish feast with the drunken revelry of Bacchanalia, forcing the Jews to worship Bacchus, the god of pleasure and wine. So he is basically changing. So you need not worship the God of the Bible. You can worship our gods. So he is forcing them to do all these kinds of things. The licentious festivals of Saturnalia, the worship of Saturn, was also enforced upon the inhabitants. The persecution under Antiochus led to the Maccabean revolt. So when the persecution reached an all-time high, there were some people that revolted, and you might have come across this name, Maccabean. So this family, Judas the Hammer, they revolted, and finally they rebelled against these guys. The Jewish historian Titus Flavius Josephus narrates in his book Jewish Antiquities how the victorious Judas Maccabees ordered lavish yearly 8-day festivals after rededicating the temple in Jerusalem that had been profaned by Antiochus IV. So finally, after the persecution and after the desecration of the temple and all that, they revolted, and you see this Judas Maccabees. So these guys finally took over the temple and they rededicated the temple. So this rededication happened towards the end of his reign. So and they ordered a lavish 8-day celebration of the dedication. Is it biblical? Is there a reference to the dedication of this kind of a thing in the Bible at all? Yes, if you look at it in Gospel of John, chapter 10, verse 22 to 25, it talks about, now it was the feast of dedication in Jerusalem, and it was winter, and Jesus walked into the temple in the Solomon's porch. What is John writing here? John is writing about the Jews celebrating the feast of dedication. In fact, Jesus is also a participant in this celebration. As you see in verse 23, Jesus walked into the temple during the time of feast of dedication. So this feast of dedication is basically rededicating the temple after all the things that had happened under this guy Antiochus Epiphanes. So Jesus was also celebrating the feast of dedication in Jerusalem. Is that celebrated even today? Yes, but with a different name. You know, if you have a Jewish friend, you ask them what is called Hanukkah. You know, they celebrated Hanukkah during the Christmas time, that is the feast of dedication. So basically what they're doing is, this was a festival, this was a feast, a new non-Mosaic festival was inaugurated on the 25th of Chislev to memorialize the cleansing of the rededication of the temple under Judas Maccabees in 164 BC. Following its desecration by the Syrian forces of Antiochus Epiphanes, referred to as the abomination that causes desolation. We can read that in Daniel chapter 11:31, also in Matthew 24:15. Like the earlier tabernacles feasts, this festival of dedication, or we call this now Hanukkah, was symbolized by a celebration of lights. So this is how Jews even to this day celebrate Hanukkah, because this was a big thing. You know, Jesus was also part of this rededication of the temple, of this feast or the festival, as we studied in the Gospel of John. So Antiochus in chapter 8 verse 9 and Antichrist chapter 7 verse 9. So we are going to now see the comparison between these two guys. Antiochus 4 as a type of the Antichrist. Antiochus and the Antichrist are symbolized by horns that were little or small at the beginning. So I am running with a parallel track. So on one side you see Antiochus, a little horn described. On the other side you see Antichrist described. So I'm going to show you the similarities, or a type, or a dual fulfillment, if you will, what I explained earlier. So Antiochus and Antichrist are symbolized by horns that were little or small at the beginning. Antiochus was a stern-faced king, right? And Antichrist will have an imposing look. So you see a lot of similarities going on here. I will quickly run through this because I don't have to explain all this. I'm just showing you what is the similarities here. And Antiochus was a master of intrigue, verse chapter 8:23. And Antichrist's brilliance is suggested by the eyes of the horn, chapter 7 verse 8. Antiochus had great power. Antichrist will have even greater power. Again, keep that in mind, the dual fulfillment. You have the near fulfillment and a far fulfillment with a greater power. So Antiochus and the future Antichrist. Antiochus was energized by Satan. Antichrist also was empowered by Satan. So we can read this, so I told you earlier, where are they getting these powers? So he was not of his own power. So whose power is this? He was energized by Satan in chapter 8 verse 24. And then we see the same thing happening to the Antichrist, 2 Thessalonians chapter 2 and also Revelation. Antiochus destroyed thousands. Antichrist will destroy even more. Sadly, even more. Antiochus prospered for a time. Antichrist also will prosper for a brief period. So these people had this Antiochus and Antichrist, they were given some period, and that is the time that they are going to do all this, what they were doing. Antiochus persecuted the Jewish people. Antichrist will also persecute the Jewish people, especially the Jewish people during that time are the followers of Jesus. We can read that in Revelation once we get to the book of Revelation. And Antiochus was a deceiver. Antichrist will be a master deceiver. Antiochus was proud. Antichrist will be a Megalomaniac, you see that in all these references given, chapter 7 verse 8 and chapter 11, and you see all those references given here. Antiochus blasphemed God. Antichrist will also blaspheme God. Antiochus was not killed by human hands, nor will the Antichrist. So these two characters were not killed by any human hands. So the events surrounding Antiochus Epiphanes took place during the intertestamental period and were not found in either the Old or the New Testament. So as I just mentioned, so these were the intertestamental periods that were not recorded in the Bible. That's why we see recorded in the history books. Of course, Daniel wrote, of course, if we look at it, Daniel already told this is what's going to happen during this time. So it is not that we don't have a record in the Bible. It is in the book of Daniel, but the details are not given during that period of time, during the intertestamental period. However, they were prophesied in Daniel chapter 8 and extensively recorded in 1st and 2nd Maccabees. Although the word Antichrist is not mentioned in the Old Testament, the book of Daniel calls him Little Horn. The passage describes about the small horn in Daniel chapter 8 clearly refers to Antiochus. He even exalts himself as high as the prince of the host, and by him the daily sacrifices were taken away and the place of his sanctuary was cast down. Because of the transgression, an army was given over to the horn, opposed the daily sacrifices. So I think we alluded all about the small horn earlier. So the final point here, I want to make a grim prediction here, or what the Bible says, not my prediction. So if Antiochus was a precursor for what's going to happen, or a forerunner for what's going to happen with the Antichrist, you look at this here, this particular strange verse in Zechariah. It says, "In the whole land, says the Lord, 2/3 shall be cut off and perish, and 1/3 shall be left alive." So that means what? During the Holocaust, 1 in 3 Jews were killed, right? 1 in 3 Jews, 1/3 of them. It is during this time, the Antichrist towards the end, 2/3 will be killed and 1/3 will be left alive. Verse 8 again, "In the whole land, says the Lord, 2/3 shall be cut off and perish, and 1/3 shall be left alive." That's a very sad, very sad. Sometimes I cannot even, my heart really become very heavy when I read these things. What's going to happen during the time of tribulation, and especially to the people of the Jewish people. Verse 9, "And I will put this third into the fire, refine them as one refines silver, and test them as gold is tested. And then they will call on my name, and I will answer them. I will say, they are my people, and they will say, the Lord is our God." So there is going to be a time, all the Jews, the remnant of the Jews will be saved. That is what we are seeing here. And of course, Paul writes that in the book of Romans. If you read the Romans, also says the same message. All the Jews will come to know the Lord at one time. But before that happens, sad things has to happen according to this. So in summary, the glory of the Jewish people is at its peak during the time of King Solomon, right? After King Solomon, the kingdom was divided into two, and that began the decline of the state of the Jewish people and as a nation. As a judgment upon the Jewish nation, God allowed King Nebuchadnezzar to destroy the temple built by Solomon. We studied all this until now. After the Babylonian exile, Cyrus, the Persian king, allowed the Jewish people to return to their homeland and build a temple. So we studied about that last week. The Jews had to endure oppression and persecution by the Gentile rulers during the Second Temple period. The persecution of the Jewish nation peaked when the Seleucid king Antiochus IV issued decrees outlawing Jewish religious practices. He killed and persecuted Jews for faithfully following their law. The account of Antiochus IV Epiphanes ends with the institution of Hanukkah following the king's death and restoration of the temple worship. That's what we studied today with Antiochus Epiphanes. The book of Daniel foretold about the reign of Antiochus without mentioning his name. It also described the rule of the coming Antichrist, and there are many parallels between Antiochus and Antichrist. At one time, he was even considered as the Antichrist because of the atrocities he committed against the Jewish people. Thank you for watching. If you have not subscribed to this video channels, please do subscribe. And if you like these videos, please give a like and share it with your friends. Thank you for watching. God willing, next week we are going to study Daniel chapter 9, one of the important chapters in the Bible, which talks about the 70 weeks of Daniel. Again, thank you for watching.